My name is Hunter Martinez. I just turned 18 3 weeks ago, and I thought becoming an adult meant finally having the freedom to make my own choices. Instead, it meant finally being old enough to save my mother's life, while my father sat 15 feet away watching a football game, completely indifferent to the fact that his wife was dying on our bathroom floor. It meant discovering that sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you become the very people you need protection from. I was supposed to be starting my freshman year at Arizona State University in a month, majoring in emergency medical services, because I had spent most of my teenage years calling 911 and learning CPR to deal with my mother's overdoses. Instead, I was standing in the hallway of our ranch-style house in Mesa, Arizona, holding my packed suitcases and telling my father that I was done being the only responsible adult in a family of 3 people. My mother, Carmen Martinez, was 42 years old and had been struggling with prescription drug addiction for as long as I could remember. What started as legitimate pain medication after a car accident when I was 8 had evolved into a deadly cycle of doctor shopping, pill crushing, and increasingly dangerous combinations of opioids, benzodiazepines, and alcohol. She had overdosed 17 times that I knew of, been to rehab 4 times, and had been clinically dead for 3 minutes and 47 seconds before paramedics brought her back to life on a Tuesday afternoon in July while my father watched the Arizona Diamondbacks lose to the Padres. My father, Roberto Martinez, was 45 years old and had perfected the art of willful ignorance over the past decade. He worked as a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant, came home every day at exactly 5:15 p.m., opened a beer, turned on the television, and pretended that his wife was not slowly killing herself 20 feet away from his recliner. He called my mother's overdoses episodes and claimed they were attention-seeking behavior rather than genuine medical emergencies. He had never once called 911, never once performed CPR, never once rode in an ambulance with his wife. That job had fallen to me since I was 14 years old. Growing up in the Martinez household meant learning to read the signs of impending disaster with the precision of a meteorologist tracking hurricanes. I could tell by the way my mother moved in the morning whether she had taken too many pills the night before. I could identify the difference between her prescription medications by sound when she opened the bottles. I knew which combinations were likely to send her to the emergency room, and which ones would just make her sleep for 16 hours straight. I learned to check her pulse while she slept, to position her on her side so she would not choke if she vomited, to recognize the difference between deep sleep and unconsciousness. I memorized the locations of every hospital in Mesa and Phoenix because I had been to all of them multiple times. I knew the names of the ER nurses, the questions the doctors would ask, and the forms I would need to fill out while my mother was stabilized and my father stayed home to hold down the fort. By the time I was 16, I was certified in CPR and basic first aid through a program at my high school. By 17, I had become so proficient at managing my mother's overdoses that paramedics would ask for my assessment when they arrived at our house. They knew me by name, knew the medications my mother abused, knew that I would have more accurate information about her condition than the man who was supposed to be her husband and partner. "Hey, Hunter," paramedic Sarah Johnson would say when she responded to my calls, "What are we looking at today?" "Found her unconscious in the bathroom about 10 minutes ago," I would report with the clinical detachment of someone who had done this too many times. Empty bottle of Percocet on the counter, half-empty wine glass on her nightstand. Pulse is weak, but present. Breathing is shallow, pupils are pinpoint. No response to verbal or physical stimuli. Good work, kid. You probably saved her life by calling when you did. But after 18 years of saving my mother's life and watching my father pretend that nothing was wrong, I was exhausted by the responsibility of being the only functional adult in our household. I was tired of being the one who flushed pills down the toilet, who scheduled intervention meetings that my father refused to attend, who researched treatment facilities, and begged my mother to get help. Most of all, I was tired of watching my father enable my mother's addiction through his complete refusal to acknowledge its severity or take any responsibility for addressing it. The final overdose happened on a Tuesday afternoon in July, 3 weeks after my 18th birthday, and 1 month before I was supposed to leave for college. I was in my bedroom packing boxes with my high school graduation gifts and acceptance letters, trying to convince myself that it was safe to leave my mother alone with my father for the first time in years. I had been accepted to Arizona State University's Emergency Medical Services program with a partial scholarship based on my volunteer work with the local fire department and my experience managing medical emergencies at home. The irony was not lost on me that my mother's addiction had prepared me for a career in saving other people's lives. My father was in the living room watching a Diamondbacks game, drinking his second beer of the afternoon and shouting commentary at the television as if the players could hear his advice. My mother had been in the bathroom for about 20 minutes, which was not unusual. She often spent long periods in there when she was under the influence, sometimes falling asleep on the floor or becoming confused about where she was. But something felt different that afternoon. The house was too quiet except for the sounds of the baseball game and my father's occasional yelling at the TV. Usually, I could hear my mother moving around, running water, opening and closing cabinet doors as she searched for her hidden pill stashes. Today, there was nothing. I put down the textbook I was packing and walked to the bathroom door. "Mom, you okay in there?" No response. "Mom." I knocked on the door, which was unlocked. "I'm coming in." What I found when I opened that door was a scene I had witnessed variations of 17 times before, but somehow it felt different this time. More final, more dangerous. My mother was lying on the bathroom floor between the toilet and the bathtub, unconscious, her lips tinged blue, her breathing so shallow that I had to put my ear to her chest to confirm she was still alive. There was an empty prescription bottle on the counter, OxyContin that should have lasted her 2 weeks, but had been filled just 3 days ago. Next to the sink was a partially crushed pill and a drinking straw, evidence that she had been snorting the medication to increase its potency. But what made this overdose different from all the others was not just the severity of her symptoms, but what happened when I called for my father's help. "Dad," I shouted from the bathroom doorway, "I need you in here right now. Mom's unconscious." "She's fine," he yelled back without looking away from the television. "She's just sleeping off whatever she took. Leave her alone and she'll wake up in a few hours." "Dad, she's not breathing right. I need help moving her." "Hunter, stop being dramatic. Your mother has done this 100 times. She knows how much she can take." I stared at him in disbelief. He was sitting in his recliner, beer in one hand, remote control in the other, completely focused on a baseball game, while his wife was potentially dying 30 feet away. "Dad, I'm calling 911. "No, you're not. We're not doing this again. I'm tired of the ambulances and the neighbors staring and the hospital bills. Let her sleep it off. She could die." "She's not going to die. She's just being dramatic." That was the moment I realized that my father was not just neglectful or in denial. He was actively endangering my mother's life by preventing her from receiving medical care. For years, I had thought he was simply overwhelmed or afraid. Now I understood that he had made a conscious decision to prioritize his own comfort over his wife's survival. I called 911 from my cell phone without asking his permission again. 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Hunter Martinez at 1247 Desert Vista Drive in Mesa. My mother has overdosed on prescription medication. She's unconscious, barely breathing, lips are blue." I need an ambulance immediately. Is she responsive to verbal or physical stimuli? No response to either. This is her 18th overdose that I know of. I'm certified in CPR, and I've moved her to the recovery position. Good job, Hunter. We have paramedics en route. Stay on the line with me. While I was on the phone with the 911 dispatcher, providing details about my mother's condition and medical history, I could hear my father in the living room getting increasingly agitated about my decision to call for help. Damn it, Hunter. Hang up that phone. We don't need the whole neighborhood knowing our business again. Your son is doing the right thing, sir, the dispatcher said, having overheard my father's objections. Your wife needs immediate medical attention. My wife needs to learn that her actions have consequences. If she wants to take pills, she can deal with the consequences herself. I had to walk outside to continue the conversation with the dispatcher because my father's yelling was making it difficult to communicate. As I stood in our front yard, watching for the ambulance and trying to answer questions about my mother's medications and medical history, I could hear him inside, not checking on his wife, not helping with the emergency, but complaining about the inconvenience and embarrassment of having paramedics at our house again. When the ambulance arrived, Sarah Johnson and her partner Marcus Williams approached our house with the resigned familiarity of first responders who had been here too many times before. How long has she been down, Hunter? Sarah asked as we rushed toward the bathroom. Found her about 15 minutes ago. Called you guys immediately. Dad thinks she's just sleeping, but her breathing is really shallow and her color is terrible. Where's your dad? Living room. Watching TV. He doesn't want you here. Sarah exchanged a look with Marcus that I had seen before. The expression medical professionals get when they encounter family members who are more obstacle than help during emergencies. When we reached the bathroom, Sarah immediately began assessing my mother's condition while Marcus prepared emergency medications. I could see from their body language that this overdose was more serious than some of the previous ones. Hunter, good job on positioning. She definitely would have aspirated if you hadn't moved her. Sarah was checking my mother's pulse and breathing while Marcus prepared in 4-line. Her vitals are really unstable. We need to get her to the hospital immediately. Is she going to be okay? We're going to do everything we can. You probably saved her life by calling when you did. As they loaded my mother onto a stretcher and prepared to transport her to Mesa General Hospital, my father finally appeared from the living room, not to help or show concern, but to complain about the disruption to his afternoon. This is ridiculous, he said to Sarah as she adjusted my mother's oxygen mask. She does this all the time for attention. Now you're going to take her to the hospital, where they'll pump her full of more drugs and send us a bill for $10,000. Sir, your wife is in critical condition. She needs immediate emergency care. My wife is a drama queen who likes to cause problems when I'm trying to relax. Sarah looked at my father with barely concealed disgust, then turned to me. Hunter, are you riding with us or following in your car? I'll follow in my car, I said, grabbing my keys and my mother's insurance information. I had done this routine so many times that I could navigate to Mesa General with my eyes closed. As the ambulance pulled away with lights and sirens, my father stood in our driveway, not watching his wife being taken to the hospital, but looking annoyed that the neighbors were standing outside their houses observing the drama. Great, he muttered. Now I'll have to listen to questions from the Hendersons for the next month. At the hospital, I sat in the emergency room waiting area for 4 hours while doctors worked to stabilize my mother and determine exactly what combination of substances had caused her overdose. Dr. Patricia Rodriguez, who had treated my mother several times before, eventually came out to update me on her condition. Hunter, your mother is stable now, but this was a close call. Her respiratory system was severely depressed, and she was minutes away from complete respiratory failure when the paramedics brought her in. Is she going to recover? Physically, yes. We've given her naloxone to reverse the opioid effects, and her breathing has improved significantly. But Hunter, I have to tell you, this level of overdose suggests that your mother's addiction has escalated to an extremely dangerous point. The combination of medications we found in her system could easily have been fatal. What happens now? We're going to keep her overnight for observation, and then she'll need to make some serious decisions about treatment. This cannot continue. The next overdose could kill her. What about my dad? Shouldn't someone talk to him about what happened? Dr. Rodriguez looked uncomfortable. Where is your father, Hunter? At home, watching TV. He didn't come to the hospital. He didn't come to the hospital while his wife was fighting for her life. He said she was being dramatic and that he was tired of dealing with her episodes. Dr. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what I had told her. Hunter, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you feel safe at home? Are your parents able to take care of themselves and you? I take care of myself, and I take care of Mom when she overdoses. Dad doesn't really participate in any of that. How long has this pattern been going on? Since I was about 14. That's when I started calling 911 instead of just trying to wake her up myself. And your father has never called for medical help during any of your mother's overdoses? Never. He usually gets angry at me for calling you guys. He thinks Mom does this for attention. Hunter, your mother nearly died today. This was not attention-seeking behavior. This was a medical emergency that required immediate intervention. I know that. I've always known that. But Dad refuses to accept it. Dr. Rodriguez made some notes in her chart, then looked at me with an expression of deep concern. Hunter, you have been carrying an enormous responsibility for someone your age. What you did today, recognizing the emergency, calling 911, positioning your mother correctly, providing accurate medical information to the paramedics. That level of competence probably saved her life. But you shouldn't have to be your mother's primary caregiver. That's not your job. It's been my job for 4 years because no one else will do it. That needs to change. Your mother needs professional help, and your family needs intervention. When my mother woke up the next morning, she followed the same script she had used after every previous overdose. Apologies, promises to get clean, claims that this time was different, and requests for me not to tell anyone outside the family what had happened. Mijo, I'm so sorry you had to deal with that yesterday, she said, her voice hoarse from the breathing tube that had been inserted during her treatment. I never meant for you to find me like that. Mom, you almost died. Dr. Rodriguez said you were minutes away from respiratory failure. I know, baby. I made a mistake with my medication. I took too many pills because the pain was really bad yesterday. Mom, you crushed up OxyContin and snorted it. That's not a medication mistake. That's drug abuse. Hunter, please don't talk like that. I'm not a drug addict. I just have chronic pain from my car accident, and sometimes I need more medicine than the doctors prescribe. You've been saying that for 10 years. The car accident was a decade ago, and you've been escalating your pill use every year since then. That's not fair. You don't understand what it's like to live with constant pain. I understand what it's like to live with constant fear that I'm going to find you dead. I understand what it's like to be the only person in our house who cares whether you survive your addiction. Your father cares. He just shows it differently. Dad didn't even come to the hospital, Mom. He spent yesterday evening complaining about the ambulance bill while you were fighting for your life in the ICU. He was scared. Men sometimes have trouble expressing their emotions when they're frightened. He wasn't scared. He was annoyed. There's a difference. This conversation, like all our previous conversations after her overdoses, ended with my mother making promises she would not keep and asking me to keep secrets that were slowly killing our family. "Mijo, promise me you won't tell anyone at school what happened. I don't want people to think badly of our family." "Mom, I'm 18 years old. I'm not in high school anymore. I graduated 3 months ago." "Promise me you won't tell anyone at college, then. Promise me this stays in our family." "This has been staying in our family for 10 years, and it's gotten progressively worse. Maybe it's time to involve other people." "What do you mean?" "Maybe it's time for you to go to rehab. Real rehab, not just the outpatient programs you've tried before." "Hunter, I can't go away for months. What would happen to the house? What would happen to your father? Dad is 45 years old. He can take care of himself. And maybe if you weren't around to enable his denial, he'd have to face reality about your addiction. You don't understand how complicated this is. I understand that you almost died yesterday, and if something doesn't change drastically, the next overdose will kill you. When I picked up my mother from the hospital that afternoon, my father was waiting in the driveway, but not to welcome her home or express relief that she had survived. He was angry about the hospital bill and the inconvenience of having to miss work to deal with what he called Carmen's latest drama. 2 days in the hospital, he said before my mother had even gotten out of the car. Do you have any idea how much that's going to cost us? Do you have any idea how embarrassing it was for me to have to explain to my boss why I couldn't come in today? Roberto, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. You never mean for it to happen, but it keeps happening anyway. Maybe it's time for you to take some responsibility for your actions. She almost died, Dad, I said, unable to contain my frustration any longer. She was clinically unconscious when I found her. The doctors said she was minutes away from respiratory failure. The doctors always say that. They want to justify their expensive treatments and make us feel guilty for questioning their bills. She couldn't breathe on her own. They had to put her on a ventilator. If she was really that sick, why is she walking around today like nothing happened? Because the doctors saved her life with emergency medication and life support. Or because she was never as sick as everyone claimed, and this whole thing was blown out of proportion like always. I stared at my father in disbelief, even after watching paramedics perform life-saving measures on his wife. Even after being told by medical professionals that she had nearly died, he was still insisting that the entire emergency had been fabricated for attention. That night, while my mother slept off the effects of her hospital stay and my father watched television as if nothing had happened, I sat in my bedroom and made a decision that would change the trajectory of my entire life. I could not save my mother from her addiction if she did not want to be saved. I could not force my father to acknowledge reality if he was determined to live in denial. But I could save myself from the toxic cycle of addiction, enablement, and crisis management that had defined my family for the past decade. I was 18 years old, legally an adult, and I had been accepted to college with enough financial aid to support myself without depending on my parents. For the first time in my life, I had the option to leave, and I was finally ready to take it. I spent the next week researching early move-in options at Arizona State University and arranging to start my emergency medical services program a month ahead of schedule. I found a summer job working as an aide at a Phoenix hospital, which would provide both income and valuable experience for my future career. Most importantly, I started the process of emotionally preparing myself to leave my mother in the hands of a father who had proven repeatedly that he could not or would not protect her from her own self-destructive behavior. The hardest part was not the logistics of leaving home early, but the knowledge that I was potentially abandoning my mother to face her addiction without the safety net I had provided for years. I had been her early warning system, her medical advocate, and her lifeline during emergencies. Without me, she would be completely dependent on my father's willingness to recognize and respond to medical crises. But I also knew that my constant intervention had become part of the problem. By managing the consequences of my mother's addiction so efficiently, I had enabled both of my parents to avoid facing the true severity of her condition. My mother could continue using drugs knowing that I would call 911 when necessary. My father could continue denying reality, knowing that I would handle any actual emergencies. If you're starting to understand how being the responsible one in a dysfunctional family can become a trap that prevents real change, then you'll want to hear what happened when I finally decided to step back. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when it means the people you care about might face consequences you've been protecting them from. Subscribe because the next part of this story will show you what real courage looks like. My final week at home was surreal in its normalcy. My mother recovered from her overdose the way she always did, a few days of weakness and nausea, followed by promises to be more careful with her medication, followed by a gradual return to the same patterns that had led to the emergency in the first place. My father returned to his routine of work, television, and willful blindness as if nothing had happened. But I was different. For the first time in years, I was not watching my mother for signs of impending overdose. I was not counting pills or checking her pulse while she slept. I was not researching new rehab programs or intervention strategies. Instead, I was packing my belongings and mentally preparing for a life where my mother's addiction would no longer be my responsibility to manage. The change in my behavior was subtle but significant. When my mother asked me to drive her to a doctor's appointment that I suspected was actually an attempt to get new prescriptions, I declined and suggested she ask my father or take public transportation. When she started displaying early signs of drug-seeking behavior, restlessness, frequent trips to the bathroom, complaints about pain that seemed to correlate with her pill schedule, I did not intervene or try to distract her with other activities. Most significantly, when I found a hidden stash of pills in her bedroom while helping her change her sheets, I did not confiscate them or flush them down the toilet as I had done dozens of times before. Instead, I left them where they were and simply noted their location in case future medical personnel needed to know what substances she had access to. My father noticed the change in my behavior before my mother did. "Hunter, your mom seems to be having some pain issues again," he said one evening while we were both in the kitchen. "Maybe you should talk to her about seeing her doctor." "Dad, Mom's pain issues are between her and her doctor, and between her and you. I'm not her case manager. But you've always been so good at helping her with her medical stuff. I've been good at enabling her addiction and covering for your neglect. That's different from helping. That's not fair. I work hard to support this family. Working hard to pay bills is not the same as taking care of your wife's health and safety. Your mother is a grown woman who can make her own decisions about her medication. If you really believe that, you wouldn't be asking me to intervene when you think she's having problems." These conversations revealed something I had not fully understood before. My father was not just in denial about my mother's addiction. He was completely dependent on me to manage it for him. He wanted to maintain the illusion that he was not responsible for addressing her drug abuse, but he also wanted the security of knowing that someone else was monitoring the situation and would handle any emergencies. My withdrawal from that role forced him to confront the reality that he would soon be the only person responsible for his wife's welfare, and he was not prepared for that responsibility. 3 days before I was scheduled to leave for college, my mother had what I knew would be another overdose. I could see the signs developing throughout the afternoon: the restlessness, the frequent trips to the bathroom, the slurred speech, the glassy-eyed stare that indicated She had taken far more medication than her tolerance could handle. In the past, I would have started preparing for the inevitable emergency. I would have checked that my phone was charged, positioned her near a phone in case I needed to call 911, and monitored her condition closely so I could intervene at the first sign of serious distress. This time, I went to my room and continued packing. Around 8 o'clock in the evening, I heard the familiar sound of something falling in the bathroom, followed by my mother calling my name in the weak, confused voice that always preceded her most serious overdoses. "Hunter? Mijo? Can you help me?" For a moment, I felt the familiar surge of adrenaline and the automatic impulse to rush to her aid. But instead of getting up from my desk, I walked to my bedroom door and called out to my father, who was in the living room watching television. "Dad, Mom needs help in the bathroom." "She's fine. She's just being dramatic." "Dad, she's calling for help, and I heard her fall down." "Hunter, just go see what she wants. You know how to handle her episodes." "No, Dad. You go see what she wants. She's your wife. Don't be difficult. You've been dealing with her medical stuff for years. And now you're going to start dealing with it. I'm leaving for college in 3 days, and you need to learn how to take care of your own wife." For several minutes, there was silence except for the sound of the television and my mother's increasingly weak calls for help from the bathroom. I sat at my desk, continuing to pack my books, fighting every instinct that told me to rush to her aid. Finally, I heard my father get up from his recliner and walk toward the bathroom. A moment later, I heard him calling my name with a level of panic I had never heard in his voice before. "Hunter, Hunter, get in here right now. Something's wrong with your mother." When I reached the bathroom, I found my mother unconscious on the floor, her breathing shallow and irregular, her lips turning blue. My father was standing over her, looking helpless and terrified, clearly having no idea what to do in a medical emergency. "Call 911. I told him. "You call 911. You know what to say to them." "Dad, call 911 right now, or Mom is going to die while we're standing here arguing about who should make the phone call." "I don't know what to tell them." "Tell them your wife has overdosed on prescription medication and needs immediate medical attention. Tell them she's unconscious and barely breathing. Tell them to send an ambulance to 1247 Desert Vista Drive." My father fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed 911. While he was talking to the dispatcher, I positioned my mother in the recovery position and checked her vital signs, but I did not take over the conversation or provide the detailed medical information I usually gave to emergency responders. "They want to know what medications she took," my father said, covering the phone with his hand. "Check the bathroom counter and her nightstand. Tell them what you find. I don't know what all these pills are." Then learn. Read the labels out loud to the dispatcher. For the first time in years, my father had to take primary responsibility for managing one of my mother's medical emergencies, and his incompetence was startling. He could not identify her medications, did not know her medical history, had no idea how to assess her condition, and seemed completely unprepared for the reality of what addiction looked like when it became life-threatening. When the paramedics arrived, they looked surprised to see me standing back, while my father tried to provide information about my mother's condition. "Hunter, what's the situation here?" Sarah Johnson asked, clearly expecting me to take the lead as I always had before. "My father is handling this," I said, nodding toward my dad, who was standing next to my mother looking overwhelmed and confused. "Sir, can you tell us what happened?" Sarah asked my father. She was in the bathroom, and she fell down, and she's unconscious." "What medications does she take?" "I don't know. Hunter usually knows all that stuff." Sarah looked at me with a puzzled expression. "Hunter, I'm not managing my mother's medical care anymore," I said. "My father is her husband, and her next of kin. He needs to learn how to handle these situations himself. Sir, we need information about your wife's medications and medical history to treat her properly. My father looked at me desperately, clearly expecting me to step in and provide the information he should have known himself. When I did not respond, he began fumbling through my mother's pill bottles, trying to read the labels and dosages to the paramedics. The scene was both tragic and enlightening. My father, who had spent years claiming that my mother's overdoses were not serious medical emergencies, was now confronted with the reality of trying to save his wife's life without any knowledge of her condition, her medications, or her medical history. At the hospital, my father had to deal with doctors and nurses who expected him to know basic information about his wife's health, information that I had always provided in the past. He had to make decisions about her treatment, sign consent forms, and communicate with medical professionals about her addiction and recovery options. For the first time in a decade, my father was forced to confront the true severity of my mother's drug abuse and the extent to which he had been relying on me to manage the crisis rather than addressing it himself. When my mother was stabilized and admitted for observation, my father sat in the hospital waiting room, looking shell-shocked and exhausted. "Hunter, I had no idea it was so complicated," he said. "I didn't know she was taking so many different medications, or that they could interact with each other, or that the doses she was taking were so dangerous." "Dad, she's been taking those same medications in those same dangerous combinations for years. The only thing that changed tonight is that you had to pay attention to it. Why didn't you tell me how serious this was? I've been telling you for 4 years. You called it attention-seeking behavior and refused to get involved. But you always handled everything so well. You seem to have it under control. I was 14 years old when I started calling 911 for mom's overdoses. I learned how to manage medical emergencies because you refused to take responsibility for your own wife's health and safety. I thought she was exaggerating her problems to get sympathy. Dad, she's been clinically unconscious 18 times in the past 4 years. How is that exaggerating?" My father was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor of the hospital waiting room. "What happens now?" he asked finally. "Now you have to decide whether you're going to get mom real help for her addiction, or whether you're going to continue enabling her drug abuse until it kills her." "What do you mean, real help?" "Inpatient rehabilitation, medical supervision during withdrawal, counseling for both of you to address the underlying issues that led to this addiction and this pattern of denial. I can't afford months of inpatient treatment. You can't afford to keep paying for ambulance rides and emergency room visits either. And you definitely can't afford to lose mom permanently. Will you help me research treatment options?" "No, Dad. I'm leaving for college in 2 days. This is your responsibility now. But you know so much more about her condition than I do. Then learn. Ask questions. Read her medical records. Talk to her doctors. Take an active interest in your wife's health for the first time in 10 years. The next morning, while my mother was still in the hospital recovering from her latest overdose, I finished packing my belongings and prepared to leave home a month earlier than originally planned. My father made one last attempt to convince me to stay and continue managing my mother's medical care. "Hunter, I don't think I can handle this on my own. What if something happens to her while you're away at college?" "Dad, something has been happening to her for years. The only difference is that now you'll have to deal with it yourself instead of leaving it to me. But what if I make a mistake? What if I don't recognize the signs of an overdose? Then you'll learn the same way I did, by paying attention, by caring enough to notice when she's in danger, and by taking responsibility for her welfare. This is too much responsibility for me. It was too much responsibility for a 14-year-old too, but I didn't have a choice. Now, you don't have a choice either. On the morning I left for college, my mother was still in the hospital and my father was at work. I loaded my car with my packed belongings, left a note explaining that I would call them once I was settled at school, and drove away from the house where I had spent 4 years being the only responsible adult in a family of 3 people. The drive from Mesa to Tempe took 45 minutes, but it felt like a journey from one life to another. For the first time since I was 14 years old, I was not responsible for monitoring my mother's drug use, managing her overdoses, or compensating for my father's willful neglect. At Arizona State University, I moved into my dorm room and began my emergency medical services program with a level of focus and dedication that impressed my instructors. Professor Michael Chun, who taught our introductory course in emergency response, commented on my unusual level of preparation and competence. "Hunter, you have more practical experience with medical emergencies than some of our advanced students. Have you worked as an EMT or volunteered with a fire department?" "I've been managing medical emergencies in my family since I was 14, I told him. "My mother has a prescription drug addiction, and I've been her primary caregiver during overdoses. That's an enormous responsibility for someone your age. How did you develop such advanced skills?" "Necessity. When someone's life depends on your ability to respond correctly to medical emergencies, you learn quickly." Professor Chun became one of my mentors during my first semester, helping me understand how to channel my traumatic experiences into professional competence. He also connected me with counseling resources to help me process the guilt and anxiety that came with leaving my mother's care in my father's hands. "You did the right thing by leaving," Dr. Sandra Martinez, the counselor Professor Chun recommended, told me during one of our sessions. "Staying would have continued the unhealthy dynamic where you enabled your parents to avoid taking responsibility for their own choices. But what if something happens to my mother while I'm not there to help her?" "Hunter, something has been happening to your mother for years. She's been slowly killing herself with drugs while your father ignored her condition and left you to manage the crises. Your intervention was keeping that dysfunctional system stable, but it wasn't leading to any real improvement in her health or recovery. So by leaving, I'm forcing them to either get real help or face the full consequences of their choices?" "Exactly. Your mother's addiction and your father's denial are problems that they created and that they need to solve. Your job is to build a healthy life for yourself, not to sacrifice your future to manage their dysfunction." 3 weeks into my first semester, I received the phone call I had been dreading since leaving home. "Hunter, it's Dad. I'm at the hospital with Mom. She overdosed again, and this time I couldn't wake her up. The paramedics said she was clinically dead for almost 5 minutes before they got her back." "Is she alive now?" "Yes, but the doctors say she has brain damage from lack of oxygen. They don't know how severe it is yet." "What happened?" "I found her in the bedroom this morning before work. I tried to wake her up like you taught me, but she wouldn't respond. I called 911, but I think it was too late." "How long do you think she was unconscious before you found her?" "I don't know. She was in bed when I got home from work yesterday around 6, and she was still in bed when I found her this morning at 7:30. She could have been unconscious for 12 hours. I felt sick to my stomach, but not surprised. This was exactly the kind of emergency I had been preventing through my constant vigilance, and without that safety net, my mother had nearly died from her addiction. What are the doctors saying about her recovery?" "They don't know yet. They're running tests to see how much brain function she's lost." "Hunter, I'm scared. I don't know what to do." "Dad, you need to start making some serious decisions about Mom's treatment. This can't continue." "I know. I already talked to the social worker here about inpatient rehab programs. I never realized how close we've been to losing her all these years. She's been this close to dying every time she's overdosed. The only difference is that now you're seeing it firsthand instead of relying on me to handle it. I'm sorry, Hunter. I'm sorry I left all of that responsibility to you for so long. I was scared and I didn't want to face how serious her problem was. Dad, I can't come home to help with this. I just started college, and I can't keep being Mom's medical manager. I understand. I need to learn how to take care of my own wife. My mother survived that overdose, but she did suffer mild brain damage that affected her short-term memory and cognitive processing. The neurologist explained that repeated oxygen deprivation from multiple overdoses had caused cumulative damage to her brain tissue, and that future overdoses would likely cause additional impairment. Your wife's brain cannot tolerate any more episodes of respiratory depression, Dr. Jennifer Park told my father during one of their consultations. The next overdose will likely cause severe permanent disability or death. That medical reality, combined with my father's newfound understanding of how close he had come to losing his wife, finally motivated him to take real action toward addressing my mother's addiction. With the help of the hospital's social worker, he arranged for my mother to be transferred directly from the medical unit to an inpatient rehabilitation program at a facility in Phoenix. For the first time in her addiction history, she would receive medically supervised detox, intensive counseling, and long-term support for recovery. My father also began attending Al-Anon meetings and individual therapy to address his own patterns of denial and enablement. For the first time in years, both of my parents were receiving professional help for the addiction and family dysfunction that had defined our household since I was a child. I visited my mother at the rehab facility during my first semester break, and I was struck by how different she seemed. The cognitive effects of her brain damage were noticeable. She had trouble remembering recent conversations and sometimes seemed confused about where she was. But she also seemed more present and engaged than she had been in years. "Mijo, I'm so sorry for what I put you through," she said during our visit. "The counselors here helped me understand how my addiction affected you and your father. I never realized how much responsibility I was putting on you. Mom, I'm just glad you're getting real help. The doctors say I might not ever be exactly the same as before because of the brain damage, but maybe that's not such a bad thing. The person I was before was slowly killing herself and hurting everyone who loved her. How do you feel about the cognitive changes? It's scary sometimes when I can't remember things I should remember. But the counselors say that's a small price to pay for being alive and having a chance to get better." My mother completed 90 days of inpatient treatment, followed by 6 months in a sober living facility, followed by 2 years of intensive outpatient counseling and support groups. She had 2 brief relapses during her first year of recovery, but both times, my father recognized the warning signs immediately and got her back into treatment before she suffered any serious medical consequences. By my sophomore year of college, my parents had transformed into people I barely recognized. My father had learned to be an attentive and supportive partner who monitored my mother's health without enabling her addiction. My mother had developed coping strategies for managing pain and stress that did not involve drugs, and she had become an advocate for addiction recovery in our community. Your parents' recovery is one of the most dramatic transformations I've seen in my 15 years of practice, Dr. Martinez told me during one of our counseling sessions. They went from a completely dysfunctional system where addiction was being managed but not treated, to a healthy partnership focused on genuine recovery and mutual support. Do you think it would have happened if I had stayed home and continued managing my mother's overdoses? Absolutely not. Your intervention was preventing them from experiencing the natural consequences of their choices. By removing yourself from that role, You force them to either get real help or face the possibility of losing everything. But my mother did suffer brain damage because I wasn't there to prevent that overdose. Hunter, your mother was going to suffer brain damage eventually regardless of your intervention. Repeated overdoses cause cumulative neurological damage, and she had already experienced 17 episodes of oxygen deprivation before you left home. The brain damage she suffered was not caused by your absence. It was caused by years of drug abuse that neither of your parents was willing to address seriously. So by leaving, I actually saved her life in the long run. By leaving, you saved your own life and gave your parents the opportunity to save theirs. If you had stayed, all three of you would have continued in the same destructive pattern until your mother died from her addiction. I graduated from Arizona State University with a degree in emergency medical services and a minor in addiction counseling. I was hired immediately by the Phoenix Fire Department as a paramedic, and I specialized in responding to overdose calls and working with families affected by addiction. My first day on the job, I responded to an overdose call that was eerily similar to the hundreds of emergencies I had managed in my own home. A 23-year-old woman had called 911 because her father had overdosed on prescription painkillers, and she was performing CPR when we arrived. "Thank God you're here," she said as my partner, and I took over her father's care. I've been doing this for years, but this time I thought I was going to lose him. "You did exactly the right thing," I told her as we loaded her father into the ambulance. "Your quick thinking probably saved his life. Will he be okay?" "We're going to do everything we can. What's your name?" "Jessica. Jessica Rodriguez." "Jessica, has your father been to treatment for his addiction?" "We've tried a few outpatient programs, but he always goes back to using pills. My mom keeps enabling him, and I keep calling 911 when he overdoses." "How old are you, Jessica?" 23. I've been managing his overdoses since I was 18. I saw myself in Jessica's tired eyes and competent hands, and I understood that she was trapped in the same cycle of crisis management that had defined my teenage years. "Jessica, I want to give you some information about resources for families dealing with addiction. There are support groups and counseling services that can help you and your mother learn healthier ways to respond to your father's drug abuse." I don't know if my parents would be willing to try anything new. We've been dealing with this the same way for years. Sometimes the people who love addicted individuals have to change their approach before the addict is willing to change. You might not be able to save your father from his addiction, but you can save yourself from spending your life managing the consequences of his choices. I gave Jessica my business card and the contact information for several family support services. I also told her about my own experience growing up in a household affected by addiction and the difficult decision I had made to step back from managing my mother's medical emergencies. I left home and let my parents face the consequences of my mother's addiction without my intervention. I told her. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most important thing I could do for all of us. "What happened to your parents?" "My mother nearly died from an overdose that my father had to manage alone, but that crisis finally motivated both of them to get real help. She's been clean for 3 years now, and they're both in recovery." "You think I should stop calling 911 when my father overdoses?" "I think you should talk to a counselor about healthy boundaries and let professionals help you figure out what's best for your situation. But I can tell you this. As long as you're managing the consequences of your father's addiction, he doesn't have to face the full reality of how his choices are affecting his family." 6 months later, Jessica called me to tell me that she had moved out of her parents' house and that her father had entered inpatient treatment after a near-fatal overdose that her mother had been forced to handle alone. "You were right," she said. As long as I was there to call 911 and manage the emergencies, my parents could pretend that his addiction wasn't life-threatening. When I stepped back, they had to confront how serious the problem really was. How are you doing with the transition? It's hard. I feel guilty sometimes when I think about him overdosing and me not being there to help. But I'm also sleeping better than I have in years, and I'm starting to build a life that isn't centered around managing someone else's addiction. These conversations with families affected by addiction became a regular part of my work as a paramedic. I found that my personal experience with addiction and family dysfunction gave me unique insights into the complex dynamics that often prevent addicted individuals and their families from seeking effective treatment. I also started speaking at high schools and community groups about the impact of addiction on family members, particularly children and young adults who often become caregivers for addicted parents. Addiction is a family disease, I would tell audiences. It affects everyone in the household, but often the people who aren't using drugs become responsible for managing the crises, covering up the problems, and protecting the addicted person from the consequences of their choices. The most loving thing you can do for someone with an addiction is to stop enabling their drug use and allow them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. That might mean they face legal problems, lose their job, damage their relationships, or even suffer serious medical consequences. But it also means they might finally get motivated to seek real help. My mother often came to these presentations to share her perspective as someone who had been in active addiction for a decade before getting clean. My son was 15 years old when he started calling 911 for my overdoses. She would tell audiences, her voice steady but emotional. He learned CPR. He memorized my medications. He knew exactly what to tell paramedics when they arrived at our house. I thought he was helping me, but he was actually enabling me to continue using drugs without facing the full consequences. The day he decided to stop managing my overdoses was the day I almost died. But it was also the beginning of my recovery, because for the first time, my husband had to confront how serious my addiction was and how close he was to losing me. Hunter saved my life by refusing to continue saving my life. That sounds contradictory, but it's true. His intervention was keeping me alive in the short term, but preventing me from getting the help I needed in the long term. Today, I am 26 years old and have been working as a paramedic for 4 years. I have responded to hundreds of overdose calls and have worked with dozens of families struggling with addiction. My mother has been clean for 5 years and works as a peer counselor at the same treatment facility where she got sober. My father volunteers with Al-Anon and speaks to other family members about the importance of setting healthy boundaries with addicted loved ones. Our family relationships are stronger now than they were during my childhood, but they are also very different. I am no longer my mother's caregiver or my father's link to reality about addiction. Instead, we are 3 adults who have each taken responsibility for our own recovery and growth. I'm proud of the man you've become, my father told me during our most recent family dinner, and I'm ashamed of the burden we put on you during your teenage years. Dad, you weren't ready to face Mom's addiction until you had no choice. I don't blame you for being overwhelmed by something you didn't understand, but you were just a kid, and you shouldn't have been responsible for keeping your mother alive. You're right, but that experience taught me skills and gave me perspective that helps me save other people's lives now. Maybe everything happened the way it was supposed to happen. Do you ever regret leaving home when you did? Never. It was the best decision I ever made, for all of us. My mother, who now has some lasting cognitive effects from her years of drug abuse, but is otherwise healthy and engaged, has become one of my closest friends and strongest supporters. Mijo, I know I can never make up for the years when you had to be the parent while I was lost in my addiction, she said during a recent conversation. "But I want you to know that I see you now, and I'm amazed by the person you've become. Mom, you've been clean for 5 years, and you help other people get sober every day. You've made up for those years by becoming someone I can be proud of. Do you think other young people in situations like yours should leave home the way you did?" I think every situation is different, but I think young people need to know that they have options. They don't have to sacrifice their entire lives to manage someone else's addiction. Looking back on that 18-year-old boy who packed his bags and left home rather than continue enabling his parents' dysfunction, I am proud of the choice he made. It was terrifying to walk away from people I loved when they were clearly unable to take care of themselves, but it was also the most important act of self-preservation and genuine love I have ever attempted. My mother's near-death experience forced my parents to confront reality and seek professional help. My absence from their crisis management system created space for them to develop their own coping strategies and support networks. My decision to prioritize my own future over their immediate needs ultimately gave all of us the opportunity to build healthier lives. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people who are destroying themselves is to stop preventing them from experiencing the natural consequences of their choices. Sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is trust that the people you care about are capable of change, even when they have shown no evidence of that capacity in the past. Sometimes growing up means accepting that you cannot save people who do not want to be saved, and that trying to do so will only prevent both of you from living the lives you are meant to live. If you are in a situation where you feel responsible for managing someone else's addiction, mental illness, or self-destructive behavior, I want you to know that you have options. There are resources, support systems, and professionals who can help you learn healthy boundaries and make decisions that protect both your future and the well-being of the person you are trying to help. You are not responsible for fixing other people's problems, no matter how much you love them. Your job is to build a life that reflects your own values and goals, not to sacrifice your potential to compensate for someone else's dysfunction. Sometimes the most mature thing an 18-year-old can do is recognize when it is time to step back and let the adults in their life finally learn how to be adults. Thank you for listening to my story of growing up faster than I ever wanted to. I've left 2 more stories on your screen, both from young men who learned that sometimes becoming an adult doesn't happen at 18. It happens the moment your family needs you to be strong. Click on whichever one speaks to you. And if you want to join our community of people who understand what it's like to be forced to grow up overnight, that notification bell is waiting. Until tomorrow, remember, age is just a number, but courage defines who you really are.